Welcome back. In this week's Letter from London, my conversation with the daughter of a Hollywood legend who's putting her own difficult childhood in the spotlight. For E.A. Hanks, shuttling between divorced parents, it could seem quite glamorous, often on movie sets alongside her famous father, Tom. But growing up with her late mother, the actress Susan Dillingham, was a very different story, often dark and unstable. In her new autobiography, The Ten, Hanks takes readers on a cross-country journey, recreating a trip along Interstate 10 that she had taken with her mother to try and unearth her past and come to terms with it. First of all, thank you for being here.
It's my immense pleasure.
Secondly, I said a lot of things in that intro that's uncomfortable, frankly. Was it difficult to write about your mother, warts and all, in this incredibly revealing way?
It wasn't uncomfortable because it's the truth. And I think even if the truth is uncomfortable, that's where I'm most interested in going. If my father's world is a fantasy and my mother's world was a nightmare, I think the book is really about trying to ground myself not only in my reality, but in the larger reality that is America, which is very good on a road trip.
So just so that we understand, what was it that made you afraid and what was the abuse that you suffered at her hands?
I think if you grow...
What was her condition?
Well, she never had a formal diagnosis because obviously she refused to see mental health professionals. But me and my therapist, you can imagine, have discussed it once or twice. And the kind of working definition that I have that helps me kind of put her in a context is a paranoid bipolar disorder with sort of delusional tendencies. Because my mother heard the voice of God, which she answered out loud in public all the time. So she was a sort of bizarre figure who had a very hard time keeping reality in line, which is why I had so many questions. I didn't know where she was born. I didn't know how she grew up. I didn't know where she went to high school or what her first job was. I barely knew how she met my father. Which, by the way, was in the theater department of Sacramento State. And the fear that I had from her is the fear that anyone has of someone whose temper has no limit and who can be set off by anything. I've realized in the course of talking about this book that my mom was my first beat. Because when you have a beat, you know it inside and out. I could tell what would set her off before it set her off. I could tell if it was a good day or a bad day. And that microscopic detail to someone's temper means that it's a life on very thin ice.
And yes, as you've described it in the book, and something very burdensome for a young child to have to grapple with. She was also, you say, a cocaine addict for a while. Look, you have a pretty... many interesting passages, but we're going to ask you to read one passage from the book that describes this mood-shifty...
Sure. For a long while, my mother and I were never alone together. She'd gathered a cast of characters around herself as a shield. For years, she had believed that my father was paying people to spy on her, following her, and tapping her phone lines. One weekend, I arrived for my visit and in our living room discovered a random man with multiple guns and a German Shepherd in tow and was told he would be sleeping in our living room from then on. That was also when I started finding guns everywhere, in the old sewing box where we kept the remote controls for the television, for instance.
I mean, you know, it does sound terrifying. And this was because you say arrived for my visit. At one point, you were separated from her.
Yes.
Your father intervened.
Yes.
What happened?
So there was one night where sort of my mother's threats finally followed through. And in a night where there was no anticipating what would set her off, my breathing seemed to set her off. Something internal just reached a breaking point, and she decided that the solution for the bad night she was having was to start hitting. And, you know, an abusive situation that does not actually usually involve physical altercation is hard to intervene in. But once we had the receipts of physical abuse, that's when I was able to essentially switch custody.
Where was Tom Hanks in all of this? How did he allow his daughter to live through this? He did intervene, but did you ever ask yourself that?
Of course, and I've asked him that. And there's a lot of history in my book, but one of the things I did not quite have space for was the intricacies of family law in California in the late 80s. And it's that thing of the courts require receipt of consistent physical abuse. You can't say, well, sometimes she talks to God and it makes my friends uncomfortable, or there's a lot of guns, because there's a lot of guns in a lot of houses in America. So the nuance became, well, what is that river that should never be crossed? And once it was, my dad was empowered by the state, by police, by lawyers to step in.
The other interesting way you put it is about your father, and you call the phenomenon around him Hank's Cola.
Yes.
You talk about how your mother viewed his success as kind of catastrophic, not stratospheric, catastrophic.
Catastrophic fame.
Talk to me about the Hank's Cola first.
Hank's Cola is how I describe the situation of my father being who he is to my closest friends. And to me, it's Hank's Cola, it's a brand. It's bought and sold, and everybody in the world recognizes it and buys it, and it makes them feel good. But if you have too much of it, it will rot your insides. It will.
You're not saying that about your dad, are you?
No, because this is what I mean by catastrophic fame. What is catastrophe? A catastrophe is an eradication. And I think there is a level of fame where parts of your humanity become eradicated. People forget that my dad is a person. People forget that my dad is an artist, and he just becomes Hank's Cola. And that is a trickle-down effect where we're all kind of dealing with the fact that there's a divide between what the public is aware of and the brand that is used to sell myriad things, from movies to instant coffee that supports American troops. And, forgets the fact that this is a working artist of once-in-a-generation talent who's a human being who has bad days.
And finally, E.A. Hanks.
Yes.
Why?
That comes from my days working at the Huffington Post, where I had to navigate a comment section that did not always, maybe you've heard of this, people don't always love women telling them about the political situations that we're navigating. So I took a hat tip from George Eliot and others. And
to change your gender, so to speak.
Yes, and there was a slightly more cynical thing where when I was starting out earlier, when SEO was still part of, second generation, third generation internet, if you Googled Elizabeth and Hanks, it would just be results for big, because it would clock Elizabeth of Elizabeth Perkins and Hanks of my dad's name. So if you wanted to find an article I'd written about something that happened in DC that week, you'd have to go to like 9, result pages in. E.A. Hanks was a lot easier for misogynists and Google alike.
And now with the 10.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Christiane.